Greg Scully here. I'm the aviation manager with State of Alaska Division of Forestry, and I specialize in the rotor program. I'm going to be doing a call when needed pre-use inspection following the standard form. We're out here at Northern Pioneer Helicopters at Big Lake Airport, one of our vendors that we utilize quite a bit. They've been gracious enough to let us come out and utilize one of their aircrafts. We've got Matt, he's the director of maintenance, and then Matt Schneider's helping out with the camera work. So I'm just going to get into it. Basically the sheet starts out date, aircraft, make and model. This is a A-Star 350B3, right Matt? B2. Yep, see? Makes a difference, especially when you're doing the load count. And then ask for pilots' names, mechanics' names, so some of the stuff specific to meeting a pilot and the mechanic for the first time at an airport, which is pretty typical before you're going to utilize an aircraft on the fire if it's not already there at a helibase, so you're not taking that aircraft over from somebody else. Asked about pilot carding, mechanics carding, departure base, departure hops, and it's supposed to have a copy of the contract, whatever contract it's operating under, a hazmat exemption, a few other things. So the vendor's already done some work getting this aircraft carded by OAS, getting their pilots carded, and then they can follow through. So a call when needed contract means they might have a helicopter available and the government might order it. It's not a guarantee. So typically, if fire orders a helicopter, they say we need a Type 3. We would call around and find out who's got one available. And then if it works out, get the manager out to meet the aircraft at a convenient location for a pre-use inspection. So there is a logbook review, which we probably won't deal with right now. Basically, we're just going to go over the conditions of the helicopter. Right off the bat, it's skin and exterior. So you're looking for anything major, and this is like an appropriate time for the pilot and the mechanic probably to be there with you, so they can have the logbook and they can guide you through it. It might be an aircraft that you're not familiar with. And there's Jim.
Is that Tom Dean on the camera?
How you doing?
Tom Dean.
No, we got Matt. So basically, yeah, man.
What are you doing?
We got it going. We're doing a video for a pre-use inspection for a helicopter manager class.
Oh, cool.
So we're gonna give you a trainee here at the start of the season to see how you do. Yeah, so basically I'm looking at, just the condition of the helicopter. So the skin, visual, you're gonna have to get a little bit dirty perhaps. Look at the belly, look to see if it's got a belly hook or not. This one does not even have a belly hook. So there's certain stuff that you're looking for. So no cargo hook, you'd be asking about that, right? So that would be something that, typically you want to have any of your helicopters available to do sling work if you can. Other stuff that you can see down here right off the bat is the wire cutter kit, the strobe lights. You can kind of get a look at the landing gear. Typically we're going to want the bear paws. They're going to be a required item. And wire cutter top and bottom. On the A-Star you got this fancy little piece of thread. I'm not quite sure what it does. It tells you which way you're going. It tells you which way the wind's blowing. On the A-Star you got the pitot tube, which is located here. And then you got your mirrors. So the way the mirrors are set up on this, I can tell that this is generally a left seat flown helicopter. And you can kind of confirm that when you come around and see that the collective's indeed set up on that side of the helicopter. Bubble window. So you're looking for condition. You're looking for any cracks, major damage. When this aircraft originally got carded and inspected, there was probably an OAS inspector out here and he was looking at it. Well, that aircraft could have been flown for 10 hours, 15 hours, 50 hours on another job before we're hiring it again. So once again, the vendor's typically not slipping anything past you, but you might have a question on condition. All of a sudden there's, a leak of some kind underneath. What do you think that's from? So continuing around, looking at the top, the inspection hatches, making sure everything looks clean. On the A-Star, Matt, you want to come help me operate the doors? And this is a good time to start talking to the pilot and mechanic about, you know, hey, we're going to utilize this helicopter. Is this our main cargo compartment? Is this the one that we're going to be utilizing? How do the doors work? Is there anything special, especially with these quarter doors, about what they don't want you to do along with what they do want you to do? So basic door operation, how that's looking. And then usually these ones are something that you've got to just basically operate. And then the jettison, of course, you're not going to be able to, you know, practice the jettison technique, but that should be labeled, set up. It should have the guard. One thing with the doors, if they have the hydraulic latches, then typically they're not going to be too fired up about leaving a door open. In a windy condition, you want to get in the habit of actually closing the doors back up. These aren't going to slam because they got the hydraulics stay, but I've seen plenty of 212 doors get slammed around, and pilots sometimes get mad about that, and mechanics. So the door operation on the quarter doors, you want to become familiar with that as the manager. So when you're giving your briefings, you know how it's done. So it's top and bottom. If I can get it figured out. And this is the door that you want to be careful of. This isn't the door that you're going to be leaving flapping in the wind. So once again, you know, it's fairly fragile. Got a little bit of a bungee cord there. This might be one of these things where it's like, pilot, I don't want you to use this door. If we're going to be moving people, cargo, whatever, everything comes in off that side, right? So that's a major part of a briefing that you would receive from the pilot and the mechanic at the start. So you're given valid information when you're briefing other folks. So you got seat belts inside. You want to make sure that those are squared away. A lot of the time with these 3 points, it's pretty self-explanatory of how they do work. And then the key one during that briefing with people, making sure that the seat belts get put back behind them as they come out. Okay, so moving on. Go ahead.
Fire extinguisher.
Yeah, so fire extinguisher, all that sort of stuff's on here. Survival kit, fire extinguisher, first aid kit is part.
Where it's located in the aircraft.
So that's part of it. It might be different in the A-Stars. It might be different in the 212. The ELT is part of that also. Typically, you'll have a different seat belt configuration in the front for the pilot seat, and generally the manager's seat sitting up front. So become familiar with how that works. And then part of our policy is if anybody's sitting in that front seat, and it does have dual controls installed like this one does, that person needs, you know, a little bit more of a briefing about responsibilities of sitting in that front seat, not to grab a control, you know, what to do and what not to do. Putting your feet up on the anti-torque pedals and putting stuff up on the dash, you know, that's when you're starting to take notes about what that pilot, you know, wants you to do and doesn't want you to do. So this has got the 2 locking mechanisms for the cargo, and then it's basically just a push. So it'll give you a max load weight, and this is another compartment. They might say no sharp objects, they might say no batteries, they might say dry goods only or whatever. So that'll utilize this cargo net. Usually it's going to have a carabiners or some sort of other latching system, just making sure that that's taken care of. And if you have somebody else delegated to be working this compartment, they know how that compartment's going to go. Not necessarily having to slam these, but how it's supposed to look when it's fully closed. Everything should be flat and kind of go with the flow.
And right now, this will set off the light in the cockpit that it is not latched. Now it is latched.
So instead of banging on it with your hand like Matt did, it might take, you know, a pretty good shove, because most pilots, if this aircraft was idling and he hears something like that, they tend to not like that. You know, boot stomping, stuff smacking against the helicopter. So one more thing of, okay, put your hands here and put some good pressure on that to close that up.
Your second baggage door there.
So we got that. So fuel cap, typically that's going to be locked up. This is the back baggage. So that's another 176 pound load. Typically with this compartment, we don't want wet stuff. Is that something that we're looking for too? We don't want a leaky canteen back there, anything that's gonna leak. So on an A-Star, a lot of the time, man, it's nice to have that, have the cargo basket. So you can plan ahead to say, okay, well, how much gear can we haul on this A-Star? In this current configuration, not that much. So one more thing to check the contract. You know, as part of a standard Type 3, you know, should there be a basket or some external capability with this aircraft? Well, a lot of the time, the pilot and the mechanic really, you know, haven't had a chance to look at the contract. Maybe the chief pilot, maybe the owner. So it's one of those things where if you've got a question that's coming up on this sheet, and he's looking at you like, well, I don't know, then it's time to refer to the contract or call me or call somebody, you know, that you can ask that question. Because in the current configuration, no cargo hook, okay, that's probably going to matter, right? You want to have the full capabilities of that helicopter. And without a basket, we're really limited to a very small amount of gear here. So something to look for. So we continue on. Tail boom. Just looking for visible conditions. One thing is they will look to strobe lights, so at some point you'll probably have to have them jump in, turn on the battery. You can look at the dials and switches and gauges, look at the different lights. You should have a light up on the rudder, running lights, and then of course the landing lights, strobe lights that are located underneath. As always, just kind of continuing on, looking for anything that might be out of place. One of the things that's on this list is the anti-theft security measures. So that would be something that locks down components in the cockpit, the locking fuel. Here's one of the components right here. What's this called?
Tail rotor lock.
Tail rotor lock. So basically that's for stabilization and for security.
Parking, just basically.
So when
the
you're
wind doesn't.
parking the helicopter. So one more thing as a manager to check out, where if you're in a windy condition, typically you might come back from a mission and shut your aircraft down, and they're going to want to tie it down. So they're probably not going to throw the sand filter cover on or the pitot cover on, but they probably will tie the rotor system down, and they might try to tie the tail rotor system down. So that's one thing to check, and that's sometimes that's specific to the Bell mediums of how that aircraft's tied down. There have been accidents in the past of miscommunication between crew members. You as a helicopter manager are that set of eyes. Before I get onto that helicopter, you know, for a mission, I'm giving it a quick once over. You know, it's the pilot's responsibility, and the mechanic has a responsibility of aircraft security, but also the preparation of that aircraft. And you're that set of eyes that should be looking out to say, man, does that look right? Something's leaking out of, hey Matt, something's leaking out of here, is that right? Oh, it's somebody's water bottle that's dripping out. No, that's not right, but that's our fault type of thing. So anything that you notice, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with that helicopter. So you're developing a relationship with the pilot and the mechanic and going through that process. Okay, so continuing on, what are we looking at? There's fixed tanks on here, that's not applicable. Skids and wheels, skids seem to be in good condition. And then we've got another compartment here. Is this usable to us? I can't open it. It's locked. I got weak thumbs. Okay, so right there it's flat carded. ELT located here. First aid kit located here. So sometimes this might be the compartment that the pilot says, this one's mine. And that's really going to cut you down as far as capacity of moving people in gear, if that's the case. That might be a company policy because that's where the tie down gear is. That's where the pilot's personal gear is. That's where a thing of oil, whatever. That's when having that exterior basket would be pretty important. Because that way you can say, okay, that's the company bin. Ours is on the back side. We've got those two bins to use, and then we've got our exterior basket. So ELT located here. Obviously that's an important briefing item. You got your external battery compartment over here. This does have a brace, so if you wanted to brace that open, but once again, if you don't have the need, oftentimes it's having somebody hold that door open while you guys are moving your stuff in and out, however you want to work it. And this does have a different hook mechanism than the other side, so you can kind of see these are basically just simple hooks versus the clips over there. So the more you can kind of figure out during a pre-use inspection and you're taking good notes, the quicker you can get going. You got to get the radios programmed. You got to check over the bucket real quick if you can. Although that is on here. Radios, typically the Type 3 helicopters will only have, we got one FM, one AM, typically.
Yep.
So smoothness of the doors opening and closing. We'll be checking this other quarter door for operation. Seat belts, generally you're not going to be putting anything underneath the seat, but you need to make sure that everything's in pretty good repair. Looks nice and clean until we start using it. If you were going to be doing a doors off flight, that's another deal. Usually you get the pilot and mechanic involved and say, hey, we want to do this mission. We want to go out and do some aerial photography, infrared cam. Generally you're going to be pulling both of these doors, right? And then seat cushions in some models are pretty iffy and staying in on their own, so you might be pulling seat cushions off. So however you want that aircraft configured, you got to get that figured out. But it's their helicopter, we're borrowing it, we want to use it to its full potential, but there's certain stuff that they're going to say, well, company policy says no on that, or where's your waiver for doors off flight? We're all like, well, it's back at the office. We don't have one. Let's see, a big one would be communication. So the intercom system. Generally, you're going to try to do some radio checks. So you'd be checking the intercom system, you and the pilot. Different dials and gauges. There is a 9-pin connector that they do talk about for utilizing if we had to hook the PSD machine into it, or if we needed to do an auxiliary radio. I know that's something that we usually get by with not having, but just making sure that the radios are working. What else did we miss for inside?
Hookup for your handheld.
So that's on the dash, the handheld hookout if we needed to do that. If this aircraft was going to be utilized as perhaps like a Helco, helicopter coordinator platform, you'd probably want that extra radio in there. And then the last thing would be to try to get some radios, frequencies plugged in. Typically, most of the helicopter companies will be sending out a spare battery pack. So if you're doing radio programming or doing whatever, and you're going to have the battery on for an extended period of time, they can just hook that battery pack right in there, and you're not going to run it dry. That's embarrassing. Okay, just looking down the list, oftentimes appropriate bucket. You know, generally most contractors will come out on a call when needed with 2 buckets and then a long line remote hook. They've got to be able to do that. That's not on this list, but part of the contract would stipulate that they need to have a remote hook with a long line. The other part of this form is the logbook review. You're looking for up-to-date inspections on the aircraft, any entries indicating damage to the aircraft, power trend analysis. We want to try to do a power check right at the start of the hire, and then every 10 hours after that. And that's something that you might be able to do. Some helicopters you might have to do it in flight. Other ones they could just do a ground power check. I'm not sure on the A-Star, Matt.
Depends on the model.
Okay, so I think that's all I got. I mean, a good pre-use inspection should probably be an hour and a half process if you're going through everything. If there's an inherent need to get that helicopter up and operating, then a good basic complete check, bucket check, and then radios. Got to make sure the radios are working right, get the frequencies set, do some radio checks, and then once you think you're pretty operational, that's when you can start calling the helibase or talking to whoever's in charge, saying, okay, well, we're set, we're operational, we're looking for a mission, and then you can kind of start filling in the blanks as you go for the rest of this stuff. The other sheet that you'll be doing as a manager is the helicopter information sheet. So exclusive use, call when needed, type of contract, type of helicopter, capabilities. So you would be filling this out and handing this over to the helibase manager, the air support, about what the capabilities of that aircraft are. If certain type of bucket, a long line, remote hook, any of that type of stuff. Usually up here in Alaska, we're not required to have fuel trucks. Some of the vendors do have fuel trucks. More than likely, we're going to be supplying government fuel, but they will have a mechanic's truck. And on these call when needed contracts, everything's built into that daily availability. So we're basically paying them a set amount per hour with an agreed upon minimum for them to be there. So it could be 3 hours, it could be 3.5 hours, it could be 4 hours. So it's a set rate. They're responsible for their own lodging, their own transportation, and their own food. There is no miscellaneous extra cost. There might be an extra airport cost. There might be, if they buy their own fuel and charge it to their company, that would be a cost that would come back to us that we would grab a receipt for and pay that separate. But more often than not in Alaska, it's going to be a dry rate paid at that set flight rate with that minimum guarantee. And then over the duration of that hire from start to finish, a guy like me would figure out what the guarantee is. So if they did not fly that hourly guarantee in that time, we would pay them that minimum amount. If they flew over, just over, or a lot over, then we're going to pay them whatever they flew. So that's nothing that you guys have to get too fired up about, but it's important to have documentation on the flight record as far as any fuel that they got purchased, worry about your fuel, any other miscellaneous costs, remarks, and then basically you follow up with an evaluation at the end of your shift on the helicopter. So
could you talk real quick about the difference between the dry rate and the wet rate?
So if I wanted to hire one of Northern Pioneer's helicopters at a wet rate, it would be for the reason that they would be flying probably from their home base out to a fire and back to a home base. So they would take care of their own fueling, and it would be advantageous for us not to have to mess around with getting fuel provided up at Talkeetna Heli Base or trying to get somebody out to like Willow Airport. So wet rate is basically flight rate with their fuel cost built into it. So this burns what, 65 gallons an hour, and then whatever the company's paying for fuel, they would put that on the invoice and say, you know, that's built into that wet rate. So we're not having to figure it out. The one thing that can hang me up or somebody up is if we were to hire them at the wet rate and didn't meet the minimum, the hours flown are at the wet rate. To meet that minimum would be the dry rate. And that's something that the paperwork lady threw in there, and I'm all like, just learn something, because I wouldn't have thought about that. So don't get too hung up on that. What we want to do is one or the other. We don't want to be switching back and forth. So typically it's an agreed upon thing. If it's convenient for us as a agency to say, yeah, let's go ahead and do dry rate, then they can furnish a fuel truck and that would be taken care of. But typically, unless you're operating out of your home base and you know pretty much 100% that you're going to be coming back to your home base or fueling out of your own fuel truck, it's advantageous for us to kind of get fueling set up at a central point and then, you know, pay that dry rate. So
If it's going to be greater than 24, you're usually going to have a dry rate, something that's point to point, like say picking up some jumpers from outside of Bethel and then done would be something we could do at a dry rate or at a wet rate.
Yeah, so I think that's about it. Like I said, part of this list is the aircraft card, pilot card. The aircraft card should be on board. Copy of the contract supposed to be on board. Hazmat exemption, ERG book. You know, those are the standard paperwork items. One thing that usually falls through is the whole fire shelter issuance and training. That's something that's kind of hard to do for a call when needed vendor. I could suggest that at the start of the season to say, hey, why don't you guys get on the IAT website, because they have to do A110 like everybody else to make sure that they're up on the hazmat stuff. They could easily watch the fire shelter video, and then when we provide them with a fire shelter, typically that's going to get stashed. What we want to try to do is capture any of that stuff that we're adding to the helicopter when you do that first load calc. Put that in that equipped weight so you're not worrying about it, you know. One thing that's caught us in the past is they should be able to tell you how much this aircraft weighs as it's configured. So if they were to take off a door and put a hoist on, you subtract the weight of the door and you add the weight of the hoist. Any type of configuration, they have to keep track of that. And Matt should be able to tell you how much this aircraft weighs right now with, you know, the survival kit and all the miscellaneous stuff in here. Not off the top of your head, but by looking at the logbook. So that's the kind of stuff. I remember being pretty nervous the first time. You know, I was out fumbling around like, what are you looking at? What do you need? And the one pilot kept insinuating, he's like, what are you looking for? And I'm going, I'm looking for this item. We don't have one of those on our helicopter. Oh, okay. That's why I couldn't find it. But they're supposed to be there to help you, right? It's their helicopter. It's their responsibility. We're using it, but you're kind of forming up as a user group. You're the government representative. You got to look out for these guys a little bit, but you're also looking out for the government's interest, and then you're making sure that you're the point of contact for anything that happens with this helicopter. Good briefings. There's no exceptions when somebody comes up and, you know, usually, you know, we've got to request a flight. The government has to request that flight for a reason. There is no more joyriding like back in the day. There was like, oh yeah, well, you know, the owner's wife showed up here in Talkeetna and wants a flight tonight, and it's like, that ain't gonna happen. So basically, we've got this aircraft on hire. Once there's a resource order in place, and we know there's a time and a place that we're expected to go, and we've got a job to do, that becomes, you know, our helicopter on contract. So we're directing them on how we want to use it. We're not pushing them into anything unsafe, FAA wise or airworthiness wise, or you know, stuff that they can't break their own company policy to do. And they sure should stand up and tell us that. And then also, if the mechanic's doing something that you're unsure of, you ask. Yeah, I saw this. You know, what were you guys looking at this morning? It looked like you were paying a little more attention to the tail rotor. Oh, well, we got an AD that we're keeping track of this. You know, every 10 hours we've got to do this extra little inspection. And the pilot's got his stuff going on too. So as part of that relationship, it's, you know, you see him doing something that you don't understand, the best course of action is to ask. And usually there's a good explanation. Sometimes not. All right, we good? All right, hope this was informative.